Good evening, esteemed colleagues and medical professionals. My name is Sandile Sihlaba, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Lancet Laboratories host the Suitcase Club webinar. Just for the sake of proceedings for today, I'll just go through some house rules. As you're aware, we've got two brilliant speakers for tonight, Dr. Albie de Frey and Professor Vardas, and they'll be chatting on their respective topics. Just to announce formally, we will not be presenting any CPD points for tonight, but after each speaker, we will definitely be welcoming a Q&A session where we'll allocate about 10 minutes for you to just go through some questions. If your question is unfortunately not part of that panel or part of that selection, we will also make provision that you have the opportunity to get a response to your question via email post the two sessions. I'd also like to share that the actual webinar will be recorded, so post the session as well. For all those that are keen, we will be sharing a link to the webinar that they can use for future reference. I think without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Albie de Frey, who will be speaking first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ndile. Let's see if we can share the screen. There you are. Can you guys see the introductory slide?
Not yet.
Okay, let's make sure we've got that. Let's go to Teams. Teams. I did too. Is there? Should have choose which screen. Oh, sorry, that was the problem. It's choosing the right one. Right, have we got the travel doctor on now as a slide, as a holder?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, excellent. Good. So thank you very much to everybody in Lancet. I'm sitting in our clinic in the fire station in Rosebank. So just to give you an idea, and this is where we normally host the Suitcase Club on every Thursday of the month. That was pre-pandemic. It's open to any interested healthcare professional, practitioner, and it's all about travel-related infectious disease, sometimes other interesting case studies that are not necessarily infectious disease, but related to travel. All cases that come to our attention contribute potentially to the GeoSentinel Johannesburg database, of which Professor Lucille Bloomberg and myself are the co-directors. And anybody who's part of the audience this evening is very welcome to submit any travel-related infectious disease cases that they think may be worthwhile submitting to the GeoSentinel database. So just to tell you a little bit more about GeoSentinel, GeoSentinel is a joint venture between the International Society of Travel Medicine and the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta in the USA. All sites participate in surveillance and monitoring of all travel-related illnesses in their respective clinics. That means that GeoSentinel gathers data from a network of approximately 60 globally dispersed clinics. You can get an idea on the map on the right-hand side there. It allows the linking of final diagnosis in migrating, traveling populations with similar geographic exposures, which means that this is an opportunity to get an alert of outbreaks across the globe, with travelers very often acting as sentinels of outbreaks. And we know that that was also the case in the pandemic. There was an announcement of cases in Wuhan in China, but shortly after that, there were cases discovered in other places in the world that have been traveling to China. It also helps with surveillance and networks with public health partners. Right, so if you do submit cases to us, if you contribute proactively, then we will alert you, we will include you on alerts of travel-related outbreaks. Travel will happen again. You may be able to access telephonic advice from Prof. Bloomberg, Dr. Schul and Roberg. Dr. Schul and Roberg are from the Mill Park Hospital in Rosebank, infectious diseases colleagues that we've had lots of contact with. And we will give you prompt feedback on diagnosis and management. And if something ends up being published by Geosentinel, the associates will be acknowledged by that as well. So having done my little selling spiel about Geosentinel and the Suitcase Club, let's talk a little bit about the ins and outs of PCRs in travel. So just to assure everybody, especially our colleagues from Saston that have joined, that travel is alive and well and happening. And that is mainly due, from a South African perspective, due to the construction and mining industry that works in particular in those areas circled on the map on the right-hand side. West Africa is very active in terms of mining. Thank heavens the gold price has gone ballistic and there's lots of gold mining happening there. And then, of course, East Africa, and many of you would know that there's lots of mining activity in Zambia. There's big oil and gas projects happening in Mozambique, and the Democratic Republic of Congo also contributes a lot to this. I quickly looked at flight radar this morning, and this is what flying in Africa looked like at about 6 o'clock this morning versus flying in Europe. For all of those that are depressed because we don't see aircraft overhead, that's not really the case in the rest of the world. It was early morning. I didn't bother to include the Americans. They're not that important anyway, but they were still sleepy. It looked a little bit like Africa. But you can see in the Far East and the Middle East, there's lots of life out there. So travel is happening in spite of the lockdowns all across the world. Coronavirus, on the other hand, is here to stay. We're going to have to learn to live and travel with it. It may become less virulent or dangerous over decades. We may get some form of herd immunity, hotly disputed in many quarters. And we hope and pray for an effective vaccine. And while we're hoping and praying for an effective vaccine, just a little reminder, the coronavirus you'll all recognize. I got into serious trouble with the WITS Ethics and Publication Committee a little while ago for distributing this infographic that says, burn your mask. What they didn't do is to note that, first of all, the mask covers the guy's eyes. And secondly, it's all about being part of a possible solution. We can't all just sit back and expect a vaccine to happen from somewhere. Currently, there are 2 or 3 vaccine trials ongoing in this country, which means that we can all contribute positively towards finding a vaccine, an effective vaccine or vaccines, so that we can all get rid of our masks eventually and start a normal life again. I don't want to spend the rest of my life behind a mask, certainly not. And also not with social distancing. So until such time as we've got an effective vaccine or some other miracle gets rid of coronavirus, leisure travel will be very limited internationally. Our borders are still officially closed, and travel for work will be cumbersome with 2 components. One is coming home and the other one is going to work. Now, as part of what we do as a company, we are very involved with the people working in West Africa in particular. And because we had paramedics stuck in West Africa for as long as 3-4 months, and they could not come home until such time as we could send up relief, the rest of the mining company situation is exactly the same. We eventually stuck our noses out and got involved in rotational flights, which is different from what is commonly now known as repatriation flights. And if you pay attention, you'll see that we've got a departure sign there at Accra Airport. And it's got Safair on there. And all of you would know that normally Safair is a local low-cost airline, but they were looking for business. We were looking for somebody to transport passengers, workers up to West Africa and back. And that's how Safair ended up flying to Accra for a couple of rotational flights. The actual coming home bit on repatriation flights, if it's not a rotational flight, it cannot be described with any other words, but the good old Afrikaans is a groot gemors, and there's some worse language for that. It's irregular, it's expensive, the dates keep on moving, and it really becomes a major source of anxiety and stress in everybody involved. Probably most of all in the people that are stuck abroad and keen to come home, with problems happening at home as well as, you know, the usual stuff about the geyser bursting, etc. But we've witnessed several tragedies where people working abroad lost family, either due to COVID or other normal reasons for getting ill and dying, and they couldn't come down here. And when they try and book on these flights and the flights get postponed, etc., it really is a serious problem. And then when you eventually get on a flight and you come home, you then get told that you have to quarantine. And so quarantine up to now meant that there were three basic options. So state quarantine is what happened to everybody and made the press every now and then if you do not pre-arrange private quarantine. And until about 2-3 weeks ago, private quarantine meant that you booked a hotel, a quarantine hotel, where you would come and spend the first 14 days of your return home. It's only recently that home quarantine has become an option. So state quarantine was 14 days until very recently, about 2-3 weeks ago, again with the latest government gazette, it was shortened to 10 days, but there's no way out. Once you are in state quarantine, you cannot come out of that quarantine situation, and you are not allowed to arrange a private PCR, as happens when you book private quarantine in a designated quarantine hotel beforehand. So typically, if you book private quarantine, you would arrive on day 0, and we were allowed by some unwritten rule that nobody can show me anywhere to send in a private laboratory technician that would go and take a PCR, a nasopharyngeal swab, on day 5. And when things were rough in terms of the COVID peak, you could wait a day or 2 for that. But if you were lucky, and in most cases now, we can get your PCR result out in 24 hours. And once you've got that, you were provided with a quarantine release certificate, and you could go home to go and complete your 14 days quarantine at home. The home quarantine option has now become available, and you apply to an email address that unfortunately I haven't put on there, but you can apply 4 days before your intended arrival date. There is no guarantee that it would be granted. And initially we got responses like, if you stayed more than 3 hours drive from OR Tambo, or if your flight arrived at 11 o'clock at night and there was no connecting flight, you weren't allowed to go and quarantine at home. And you were either then put into state quarantine, or if you had arranged private quarantine, which means that you have to apply beforehand, pay beforehand, and the hotel then applies to the Department of Works on your behalf to quarantine in a private hotel. So now if you arrive with this and you've sent in a request for private quarantine at home, but you haven't had a reply, or if Port Health is unhappy with your appearance at OR Tambo Airport, then your private quarantine allowance may be revoked. So we proposed that people who are uncertain of whether they will get granted private quarantine at home probably still book a quarantine hotel. Interestingly enough, the rules say that if you are granted leave to quarantine at home, there's no PCR involved at any stage of the game. It's only if you're in a private quarantine hotel that you need a PCR to get released before the 14-day period. Okay, so while we were dealing with these people coming back from abroad, in about July this year, I had a 54-year-old private quarantine client that we will call Mr. FQ from Panama. And indeed, he worked on a mine in Panama. And on day 5, we tested him along with all his other colleagues. And it turned out that his PCR was positive. So on a Saturday morning, I had to phone him and the other 2 guys, they all came from Panama, to say that they've got a positive PCR. And that had a big implication because he was from Port Shepstone and he intended to fly to Durban on that Saturday. Now, obviously, we can't allow a guy with a positive PCR that is likely going to infect everybody else on the flight. We can't allow him to fly. So I phoned him to say, sir, you are positive. And he wasn't surprised when I told him. He was asymptomatic, but he then told me that I was on a ventilator in Panama City for 14 days, commencing 12 April. We're now in July. Then 14 days in a ward, 52 days in a quarantine hotel, because by then they'd shut down the mine. They'd had a major outbreak of COVID. And then he was for 2 weeks on the mine, 5 days in a quarantine hotel in Amsterdam, and he'd now been back in Johannesburg for 5 days. So this was a little bit of a dilemma. He had to fly to Durban, go to Port Shepstone, but I couldn't let him on the flight. And yet it was unlikely in my mind that this guy had a reinfection, asymptomatic, 54 years old, or that I didn't think that he could still be positive, or although we know that you can get prolonged PCR. So what do? You phone the virologist on call and say, what now? Please check the results. And as we do as clinicians, remember never to tell the virologist the actual history of the patient. You've got to keep him guessing. And much to my surprise, the pathologist on call, the virologist, started off by saying, looking in his crystal ball and saying, oh, this is a very interesting PCR. And I was gobsmacked because I always thought a PCR is just positive or just negative. And this was the first time that I learned that there was something in between as well. So to just park that one there and then talk about going to work. So outbound travelers, and what is the role of PCR testing and perhaps antibody testing in this situation? So foreign travel is still only allowed for work, medical reasons, and study, but people are traveling, as we saw. Now, what are the pitfalls? So some countries restrict entry from so-called high-risk countries, and we still consider it a high-risk country, which we can debate as well. And then there is certain specific official documentation required for entry, the usual, a passport, a visa. In addition, these days, certainly for some of the countries in West Africa, a letter of an appointment and permission from the government of that country to enter. All of this has to be submitted along with a copy of your air ticket to Home Affairs by email. Now, the problem here is that, as I told you earlier on, a lot of these rotational flights even chop and change because there are problems with getting permission, landing clearances, overflight clearances. And so they can't issue an air ticket before they've got a final date, and they can't get clearances to land in a particular country before they've got a final flight manifest, a list of passengers that are going. And this is part of where the anxiety comes in trying to arrange it. And along with this, either the airline or the country that the travelers intend going to are now insisting more and more of proof of a negative PCR. And usually these PCR test requirements are time limited. And then some countries, I will show you one in a minute, also requires proof of a negative antibody test, which was controversial and difficult until recently. So going to work with your negative PCR test, you're not going to get a PCR from the state if it is for travel purposes. And if you go to a private laboratory and you're not symptomatic, certainly up to a week or two ago, the laboratory would refuse to test you because they reserved the tests for ill people or suspect cases. Your medical aid is unlikely to pay for it. It needs a doctor's request. And unless you do it in the correct way, there is the possibility that your result is delayed. And if it was a last minute request because your airline insisted you have it in the day or two before you go, you may not get the result. The little pictures on the right-hand side are just showing the KLM travel clinic at Schiphol Airport, where they're also doing these tests, and an Irish travel clinic group where they are offering PCRs for travelers. So we got involved with a mining construction company intending to go to Guinea in West Africa many months ago. They are the main contractor to a gold mine owned by Moroccans, and they intended sending 60 South Africans out there, 60 SAFers out there to go and build the mine. They are really critical, and as you all know, the gold price has just soared, so the Moroccans can't wait to have their gold, but they need the South Africans to do that. It took no less than 3 months of paperwork and negotiations to finally get them to go. It also involved 2 charter companies. The original one pulled out eventually. The flight cost $200,000. So it's $200,000 to fly 60 South Africans north and 4 or 5 South Africans south. In addition, the company elected to quarantine their people for 5 days in a hotel before they go. That was another R500,000. So I just want to give everybody an idea of the sort of money that's involved in an operation like this. So it was decided that everybody will come into a quarantine hotel 5 days before the intended departure of the flight. By the night before the intended departure, they still didn't have their flight clearances. And that we will do a PCR on arrival, on check-in in the hotel. So everybody that had contracts to go and work outside had medicals, They'd, in theory, been vaccinated. They'd been given malaria prophylaxis, in theory, because malaria is still ongoing in spite of the pandemic. And they were told to self-quarantine at home before they came in to reduce their risk. This is the sort of graph that we live by in terms of, and I'm sure most of you know that, when a PCR becomes positive, when antibodies become positive. And this particular company, sort of prompted by the Moroccans, kept on talking about they want antibody tests done. So we spent a lot of time explaining to them that antibodies it should not be used, cannot be used to diagnose actual infection with COVID-19, the COVID-19 disease, and that it should not be used. So that's just a little bit of background. This is the graph that we designed to show the engineers how it works when you become PCR positive, when you are potentially infective, and when your PCR starts waning, and when your antibodies start becoming positive, just to explain the role of all these various laboratory tests. Okay, so to move on to the next one, we got our PCR results back of the initial tests, and out of the 60 people, 5 were PCR positive, which is almost 10% of the intended workforce. The average age of this group of people was 40 years, just to give you an idea. And this is how it was all broken down. So we had 55 negative cases, 5 positive cases. The initial intention was to send the 5 positive cases home, and indeed 2 people did go home. The other 3 were senior managers, and they jumped up and down and insisted that they can't possibly be positive, can't have COVID in any way, and that they are going on this trip or on this work assignment. So we retested with the same laboratory, and we had 1 repeat positive, and then 2 of the others, one that was originally declared as positive. The laboratory came back and said that was a false positive. It probably should not have gone out as a positive. And one of the others, the test was positive, but it actually became negative. Then 2 of the patients, 2 of the clients, they weren't patients, retested privately. They went to another laboratory the very next day and announced very proudly that indeed both of those tests were negative. Now, this poses a major problem because we get phone calls from the engineer, the chief engineer, saying, do you doctors actually know what you're doing? So if we move on, I always quote Tolkien as saying, you see only what you look for. And so now the dilemma is, which PCR is correct? Do we look at the first one that is positive because we want to tell these guys they can't go on the flight, they can't go and work? Or do we look at the second one because they're desperately looking at us saying that they would like to go and work and that they believe that they are negative? So what do we do? So of the 4 travelers that retested, we then decided, in spite of everything I told them about antibodies previously, that we are going to do antibodies just to get some sort of indication of what might be happening here. And of the 4 people that we tested, 2 tested positive for IgG and 2 tested negative. So I'm going to move on a little bit just for the sake of time, and I'm going to summarize it like this because this is easier for me with mnemonics attached to them. So JPE tested positive in lab A and then negative in lab A, and the lab agreed that it was probably a false, they said it is negative. And he was antibody negative as well. So we decided he should consider that he probably never had COVID and can still be infected. NVW tested positive at lab A, and lab A insisted it was definitely positive, and then negative at lab A, and a second negative lab A. So he had 3 PCRs, 1 positive, definitely positive, and then 2 definitely negatives. And he was also antibody negative. So it's a tricky one. And what I said to the engineers is, I think he may have had SARS-CoV-2, but with a low viral level, the PCR stopped being positive between test and 1 and 2, and he still has not developed or may never develop antibodies. He should be careful, as he may still be susceptible. He may want to repeat his antibodies when he gets back from Guinea. If they are then positive, he did have COVID-19 asymptomatically, which would be good news. And then in the case of RB, we had 2 strongly positive laboratory tests at the same lab, and then a negative one at another lab, and he was antibody positive. And I considered him to have to agree that he probably did have COVID-19 approximately 3 weeks before. He is no longer infective and likely immune for the next couple of weeks or months, which may be a controversial statement. I had to give them something positive. And then the last guy was positive at lab A and then had himself tested and was negative at lab B, and he was also antibody positive. And he was happy to agree that he probably had COVID-19 asymptomatically in the preceding couple of weeks, and I assured him that he is no longer infective and likely immune for the next few weeks or months. Just the last one, this was the age distribution, and you can see the asymptomatic positive travelers were in the age groups of 31 to 39, and 3 of them were older than 40. So just to stress that they weren't young 18-year-olds that were likely to be asymptomatic, but they were indeed asymptomatic. And then just quoting this article in the latest SAMJ, the statements I made about the antibodies, emerging data around infectivity in mild disease suggests that serology results are likely to be positive only after individuals are no longer infectious. So I believe that the antibodies helped us in this case to make some medically grounded decisions in terms of allowing these people to go. So instead of leaving 10% of the people at home, eventually only one guy stayed behind, and I'm feeling a bit guilty about him. Perhaps if we tested him, he would have gone as well. What are the issues in hand? Our medical credibility versus engineer skepticism. The cost implication for the company, they rented a plane to fly 60 people, and we were going to end up sending perhaps only 55. Loss of income for the employees. They can't get on another plane a week or 2 later when the PCRs have become negative, because there are no regular commercial flights. It means that they've got to wait for another rotational charter flight, which could be weeks to months away. And then if these asymptomatic men were indeed positive and shedding virus, we would potentially infect everybody on what turns out to be a 12-hour flight, because it's on smaller aircraft. It's not a regular flight that takes 6 hours. It's the best part of 12 hours with several stops. And if they made it through the flight, they could still be infecting people on the mine. And certainly if I looked at the group when I addressed them on the Friday before they left, there were a number of people with the serious potential for comorbidities. And so we don't want somebody with comorbid disease to become infected with COVID on a remote site in a medically deprived part of the world. If they are negative, we were on the other hand depriving these people of an income, and we don't know when they can go up north again. So the controversy we have is that in the normal clinical setting in hospitals, we are concerned about false negative PCRs, and the number bandied around is approximately 30%. And there's lots of publications about the conundrum people face when they've got somebody desperately ill, they're not culturing or finding any other infective agent, and they're also not finding positive PCRs to confirm that the person has got COVID. In our setting, in the travel setting, in the non-clinical setting where we are working with asymptomatic, healthy and hungry employees, we have to be concerned about false positive PCRs as well and look for ways in which we can get around that. So just to go back to the requirement of antibody testing by some countries, Morocco is one of those. We had a lady here, a consultant, who insisted that she needed a negative PCR as well as antibody tests. At that stage, approximately a month ago, antibody testing was not available in this country at all. And so we provided her with an official letter on our letterhead saying that antibody testing is not available. It is now available, and I hope I haven't exceeded my time, but just to say thank you very much. Baie dankie to everybody, Kia Leboga, to everybody that is taking part, as well as to Lancet for hosting this particular session of the Suitcase Club. Over to you, Prof.
Thanks, Dr. de Frey. I think we're going to do questions right at the end, isn't that right, Sandile?
Yes, Prof, you may proceed with your talk, and let's do questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Great. So thanks everyone for being with us this evening, and I hope that you've had a relatively warm spring day as opposed to the last few days where we've been freezing. So Albie asked me to do this talk, and immediately I thought this is a Pandora's box. I'm opening up the grey boxes of labs, and you guys are going to look inside, and hopefully there will not be unforeseen curses that will follow us. But here goes. Let's go with this. You're all familiar with this virus by now. Here's SARS-CoV-2. It's a coronavirus, and we've named it because of the spikes that stick out on the surface of this virus, as you can see on this electron micrograph. It's important for us to note all of the various parts of the virus because we use various genes or proteins of the virus to make our diagnostic tests, to make our vaccines, and so we need to notice that. The most important one that we need to note today is the spike protein or the S protein. That, as you are all aware, is the spike protein is the attachment to the S receptor on human cells that causes a conformational change in the spike protein, fusion of the virus with the cell and entry of the virus into the cell where it starts to replicate. Then we have this grey envelope protein, membrane protein, which is the U-shaped green protein which comes through it. It's important because it's in some of the vaccines, and one of the vaccines that is being used has already started in South Africa. And then you have this big red thing in the middle. It's your nucleocapsid. It's the most abundant protein. It's the N protein or the N gene, and it's bound to the RNA genome. So that's the beast that we are all familiar with by now. This is a family photograph of the coronaviruses on the left, much like the family photograph of these people on the top right. The human coronaviruses are outlined in red, and you will see the beta coronaviruses of the B group is where SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 are from. Much like the human photograph, we have SARS-CoV-2 being the biker and the one that's going to act very differently regardless of what's happening. And you've got in this picture at the bottom the actual genetic material of SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 and MERS being shown sort of like compared, and most of it is quite similar, about 80% similarity. But in fact, these viruses, SARS-CoV-2 is actually the most similar with rat G13, which is a bat virus. So we all know this by now. Every 8 to 10 years, we have a jump from an animal into a human of a coronavirus. All of them have come from bats, and they have different intermediate hosts. MERS had the camel, SARS-CoV-1 had the civet cat, and SARS-CoV-2 probably the pangolin. There is close contact with humans through mucous membranes or fluids and eating or diet. And the final host is the human. There is increasing evidence that humans can pass on SARS-CoV-2 to domestic animals, cats and dogs, as well as in farmed animals, farmed mink in the Netherlands at the moment. This is a much more detailed family picture of SARS-CoV-2, and this is work done by our colleagues in Cape Town in an organization called NextStrain, and they have published the actual entry of viruses into the country from various different areas of the world, and which is the most abundant virus. And the most important figure for you to look at is this map up at the top here with all these circles, and you'll see the green virus, which is clade 20A, is the most abundant, came mainly from Europe, had multiple entries into South Africa, and as you can see, this is the vast majority of viruses that we have here. The 19A and 19B, the blue and the green up at the top there, those are Asian viruses from China and parts of Asia that skipped to Africa, either directly or through Europe. And then you have the green, the orange viruses here, which are 20C, clade 20C, that came from the US, mainly to Africa, and North Africa and in Senegal. And you have 20B, which is actually the predominant strain circulating in Cape Town. So you can see that these viruses are already quite different. But in fact, the good news is they are not that different, and they are not mutating as quickly as other viruses like HIV. So SARS-CoV-2, if you compare it to HIV mutates about 18 times faster than SARS-CoV-2, and that's good news. So let's turn to testing strategies. And testing strategies, this was an article that was put out by the Colleges of Medicine in South Africa. You have various reasons for testing, either you're screening, and with SARS-CoV-2, we were screening with symptom questionnaires up in the beginning. But as you realize that the symptoms are very nebulous and common amongst all respiratory viruses or viral infections, so they were relatively useless. Then we have testing usually to diagnose for the presence, and you look with PCR for the presence of genetic material. And this is where the line became blurred with SARS-CoV-2. We had to combine a symptom questionnaire with what is usually a diagnostic test to actually do our screening. And of course, surveillance, and that usually is based on quick blood tests that can be done in the field, and these are usually point of care IgG, IgM, or even laboratory-based tests. The biggest issue that we faced with this testing, even though we had combined the symptoms with a diagnostic test, was this whole Achilles heel, sorry, all the Greek stuff is coming out, of asymptomatic transmission. And it became very clear that asymptomatic transmission was a big problem. It was seen in about 13% of labor ward admittees in New York. And then we had these natural experiments occurring on the Theodore Roosevelt and the Diamond Princess. And both of these ships showed almost 60% asymptomatic infections. And so that was a big problem, because we had based our whole entire screening and containment of this virus on symptom screening and then doing a diagnostic test. And now without the symptoms, how were you going to do a diagnostic test? And yet here we are. And this is the daily COVID tests per 1,000 people for various countries over time. And you can see that South Africa, we've actually, and this was up to the middle of July or the end of July, South Africa overtook Italy. No one can reach the US and the volumes of their tests. But as you can see on this graph, they've combined antibody testing as well as PCR testing, whereas the rest of the countries are only showing PCR testing on this graph. And this is where it comes to looking in the grey box. This is your Pandora's box. We all know how to obtain a nasopharyngeal sample. There's been a lot of debate, and I'll show you some data about what's the perfect sample for a RT-PCR for COVID. Is it a nasopharyngeal sample? Is it an oral sample? Is it a nasal sample? Is it a saliva sample? So a lot of debate on that, but we'll come back to it. Obviously, whatever sample you're taking will influence how much virus you have in the actual sample that you've obtained. Once we've got the swab or the swab in a viral transport medium in the lab, we go through a process of extracting that RNA out of the patient sample, either in an automated platform, which obviously is ideal if you're doing 18,000 tests a day, as we were doing at one stage, or a manual platform where you have to do it all by hand. You take that extracted RNA, you reverse transcribe it into DNA, and then you start to probe the DNA with particular sequences of the various genes of the virus that you are looking for. And WHO up front at the very beginning of the epidemic had published the sequences that you should be looking for and had told us what defines a positive and what defines a negative. And then let me go on to the next one. So the various genes that were put together in various different commercial kits that were available for SARS-CoV-2 PCRs with this list of genes. Remember, we had the nucleocapsids, the N gene, we had a non-structural coding genes, the open reading frames 1B and 1A. We had E gene, the envelope gene, the RNA DNA polymerase, DNA-dependent polymerase gene, or the R gene, RNase P. And initially, it was you needed 2 to be a positive result. And eventually, I think it was in around just before the beginning of April, WHO said, oh, only 1 gene will give you a positive result. So here you have already another problem. So we have the problem of the actual sampling, we have the problem of the amplification, and we have now the problem of which gene you're using and which primer you're using. An important problem that people have spoken about and have not reached consensus yet is at what cycle threshold value do we amplify the actual virus? And this is a direct sort of proportion to the viral load. A little bit counterintuitive. At a high viral load, you have a low cycle threshold. At a high cycle threshold, you have a low viral load. And so this is where the indeterminates or the false positives come in, where you can have a positive PCR with a high cycle threshold, but it's non-specific. And so we have a possible false positive. And we have looked in our own lab at our very high cycle, especially single gene, especially N gene results, and have done antibody testing on some of those people. And yes, they are indeterminate results. And so I would probably fathom a guess at Albie's cases that this might have been a single N gene with a high cycle threshold that gave a false positive result initially. The bigger problem with these PCR tests are false negative results, not the false positive results. So the false positive results are quite carefully controlled. The false negatives are a big problem. So if we look at this red figure in the middle of this graph, this is a symptomatic patient that has probably the highest viral load and is very contagious. And in this instance, you still have a 20% chance of having a negative result in that individual. On either side of this individual, we have even higher chances of having a negative result. So for example, at this very beginning, we spent a lot of time trying to persuade people not to be tested immediately after a contact, because on the day of or the day after a contact, the chances that you will be negative are very high. Obviously, you've had no viral uptake or replication occurring. Even 4 days after a contact, you would have a 67%, almost a 70% chance of being negative on your PCR, but that doesn't exclude an infection. And so here's another problem. The other side of the coin, on this side, after you have recovered from symptoms, we can still detect virus for a prolonged period of time, up to 21 days, if not longer, and we've seen much longer in some instances. So the false negatives are a bigger problem with the PCRs. This is a very quick slide. All you need to look at is the colors here. Nasopharyngeal sampling is in green and the saliva samples are in blue. And what they did in this study was in admitted patients, they took both nasopharyngeal and saliva samples. The saliva sample was self-administered, so the patient spat in a bottle, much like a sort of like a saliva test for rabies, and they tested it, and it showed consistently that the viral load in saliva was much higher than nasopharyngeal. Obviously, this is very attractive for us going forward in the future, because you could get people to take their own samples and you don't need to go through that horrible process of having a nasopharyngeal swab. But we will just leave that at that for the moment. The other big issue that occurred was a whole bunch of, because of the pressure of having to have a result quickly, these rapid PCR platforms were developed, and they gave results in 45 minutes, 30 minutes, really an amazing turnaround time. Albie was saying 24 hours is a good turnaround time. I think at our best, we've had a 10-hour turnaround time. At our worst, we've had a 4-day turnaround time. And so a PCR test at 4 days is not only useless from a public health perspective, but also useless for that patient. The big problem with these rapid PCR platforms, again, was the genes that were selected. So if you look at this RDRP gene, this is the gene that has had the most mutations in SARS-CoV-2 virus. And in fact, this ID now doesn't actually even pick up some of the SARS-CoV-2 viruses. Much the same with gene checker. And so the sensitivity of these rapid platforms is very low. So you can have a negative result in one lab and a positive result in another lab, depending on did they use a rapid platform. And at some stages, and certainly I know at Baragwanath Hospital ICU, they were using gene checker And they loved it. They thought it was wonderful because they could get a result in 45 minutes. And we kept on telling them that they were putting themselves into a false sense of security because you might have a positive result nonetheless, but the sensitivity was compromised. So major issue, both from a public health perspective as well as from an individual perspective. So all in all, a PCR test that we had squeezed from a diagnostic test into becoming a screening test has many issues that make it not a reliable gold standard test. And people have pushed it and pushed it and pushed it. It's expensive, it's technically difficult. We've discussed the various issues of the false positives and false negatives, and we know that we can have compromised turnaround times when there's an increase in demand for these tests. So people started to look outside and say, well, what are the alternatives? And people looked at, as we do classically with other viral infections, we looked at antigen tests in respiratory samples, antibody tests in blood, IgG, IgM, and IgA. Mainly laboratory-based immunoassays have been our interest, and these are tests that are done in these high-throughput machines. Again, a grey box that we're looking into in our labs, but also lateral flow point of care tests, these finger prick tests that are done at the patient by non-laboratory staff. There is so much literature that on the immune response that I've actually just summarized it on this one slide, and I've tried to be simple as possible. We know there's a sequential appearance of antibodies, IgG, IgM followed by IgG. We know that the IgM comes up at about day 5 and the IgG develops around day 10 to 14. We know that the duration of the antibody response seems to be proportional to severity. So the more severely ill you are, the more likely you will develop antibodies, which puts another question mark on the asymptomatically infected individuals and whether or not they develop antibodies. We have seen it, that they do. 3 to 6 months is about the duration of antibody response that we know, and there have been big studies, a big one now that's just been published 2 days ago from Iceland that shows that it might be more than 6 months. We know that some of the antibodies are protective and we know that some of them are not, and that some of the immunoassays detect neutralizing antibodies and some of them do not. T-cell responses cannot be measured routinely in a lab easily. There's another big issue now of reinfection. What has made people likely to be reinfected, and we don't know. And this has come out in the last couple of days as well, and it is putting the immunologist back to the drawing board so that we can think about what reinfection actually means. So a person who's recovered has been reinfected. What does this mean for vaccine trials? What does it mean for us going forward as well? Quickly to look at the immunoassays. Some immunoassays have got the spike protein in it. It's important because this is the neutralizing and most immunogenic. And it has got something called the receptor binding domain, which, as we said, is the one that attaches to the S receptors. And it's really like the best part of the virus that we should be measuring. The majority of immunoassays are measuring nucleoprotein, including a lot of the rapid tests, because this is the most abundant protein and the easiest protein to detect. And it may have cross-reactivity with other human coronaviruses. And this was one of the big fears of the regulator, to say, well, it's, you won't know if it's positive from another coronavirus or not. Albie had a much more elegant version of this, but the key message of this is that early on with acute infection, direct detection of the virus by PCR is recommended. After 10 to 14 days, up to 21 days, up to 6 months, we think that antibodies are helpful to tell us whether or not somebody has had infection. As with HIV, COVID antibody tests have a window period, and that is variable. And we are saying 10 to 14 days at this point in time. As with all laboratory-based tests, you need to know how accurate your measurement is. And so the big problem that we were facing was the difficulty with the sensitivities and specificities of these lab-based assays. So I'm only talking about the lab-based assays here. And again, this is not to give you any detail, but really just to give you an impression. On the left-hand side here, we've got the sensitivity of various high-throughput ELISA platform SARS-CoV-2 assays, which have been done at various labs throughout the world and then submitted to this website. WHO has got this website called Find, where you submit your data and you share that with the world. And on the right-hand side, you have the specificities. So let's start with the good news first. The specificities, as you can see, of these assays are excellent. So they're all bunched up together, and they're all bunched up at the very top part of this graph. So the specificities, and certainly the ones that we've evaluated in our lab, are between 99 to 100%. So the false positivity rate of these COVID antibody tests are low. The big issue is the sensitivity. You can see the variability of the sensitivity, and some of these tests are below 50%. Hence, the regulator in South Africa's fear of the problems. Actually, the Lancet data is here as well, and we've submitted this, as all of the other private labs in South Africa have submitted their data here. And the tests we've evaluated have sensitivities of greater than 90%, which means they have a false negativity rate of 10%, which is not too bad, but that is at 14 to 21 days after infection. So I'm not going to spend much time on this, but the Americans were way ahead of us. They gave emergency use FDA approval for most of these tests, and we were really fighting for 5 months for these 3 tests: the Abbott IgG, the Euroimmune IgG, and the Roche IgG. And as you can see from the figures that have been submitted to FDA, and these are good figures and very good figures, but they are from the manufacturer to FDA. They're pretty good, and we have more or less been able to replicate them. My opinion of lateral flow tests is that they are bad. They have suboptimal specificity. They lead to false negatives, and they can be overly sensitive, leading to false positives. And so the death of the immunity passport, I think we need to put that behind us. It's not a viable option, and these rapid tests I have gross issues with, unfortunately. I do like the lab-based tests that are done by lab professionals, but I have a big problem with those. And so we have looked at these tests and we've said, okay, how can we apply them? And I think our applications are in these 3 main groups. Research, obviously in research, hotspot identification and investigation of hotspots and measuring of antibodies in hotspots. Community surveillance, definitely. Vaccine trial endpoints, certainly we would need our spike-based assays for that, and other outbreak investigations. We're looking at another group here of screening, asymptomatic screening, employment, quarantine facility, much like Albie has just spoken about, possibly school screening, healthcare worker screening. Lots of publications are already available throughout the world at the moment, showing that this has value because you can decide on where your risk areas are and where your risk groups are. Pre-admission screening, this is a controversial one, but you know, if you had a woman about to deliver and she had positive antibodies, do we need to do an RT-PCR or not? This is still in discussion and still being debated with the immunologists, and we're taking their opinions on board. We do strongly believe as clinical virologists that they have got some role in diagnosis as well. They can be used clinically if you have a patient with COVID with repeated negative RT-PCRs. We've seen that RT-PCRs can be negative even at the peak when they're meant to be positive, and so they might be helpful in a patient who has been ill for some time. If you have discrepant RT-PCR results, we feel that these might be helpful as well. And also, it's extremely helpful in the diagnosis of multi-system immune inflammatory disease in children and in encephalitis, where we do antibody testing in the CSF. So these are just quick studies of the uses of antibody tests. I'm not going to belabor it. Here's the big Iceland study where Iceland's Good example of an island, very nice epidemiological study where they looked at 30,000 odd people, and they found that 91% of those had recovered from COVID, and they had antibodies for at least 4 months after a PCR. What they also interestingly found was that 14% of people that had antibodies had been quarantined individuals that had not got a PCR, and so that's a very interesting statistic as well. Big studies done by big groups in New York. This is John Mascola and his group that looked at thousands of staff, healthcare workers in New York, and they showed a much lower prevalence, overall IgG prevalence of 13%. But again, interestingly, it was higher in doctors and nurses working in ICUs and emergency rooms. And then this is a very nice study that was done in long-term care facilities in Washington, where they tested 82% of the residents and they found 30% asymptomatic. We've just done a big study with the Greek old age home in Johannesburg, and we have much higher prevalence rates of residents in that have been demented and weren't talking about symptoms at all to anybody. And again, a big study in a hospital in Belgium with a prevalence of 6.4%. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I've covered the issues that we wanted to discuss, and I think we're now done from my end as well. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Vardas. Thank you for that very informative talk that you just presented. Thank you to Dr. De Frey as well for that very informative talk that you presented. It seems as if we don't have any questions. I don't know if our guests prefer the format that we'll probably put questions on the link, and then we'll be able to respond to them via email. But I'd like to just wrap things up unless there's anything from you, Dr. De Frey, or anything from you, Professor Vardas.
I'm okay, thanks. Thank you, Sandile.
Yeah, same on this side. Thank you very much. Thanks for hosting.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very, very much. So on behalf of Lancet Laboratories and the Suitcase Club, I'd like to thank all our attendees for tonight. Thank you for your time on a Thursday night. Look forward to future webinars in collaboration with the Suitcase Club as well as from Lancet Laboratories. And as mentioned previously, tonight we will be sharing questionnaires via email where you can complete any questions that you might have from tonight. We'll also be sharing a pre-recorded version of the actual webinar so that you can use that for future reference. But I'd like to thank you all. Have a pleasant evening and good night.